Hey guys, so our first poet for this week is Christina Rosetti, and her brother is Dante Rosetti, one of our other poets. A little bit about their background. Both of these children were raised in the Rosetti family. Their father was an exiled Italian patriot, and he was a poet. He was also a literary critic, and he liked to write about, guess who? Dante. And so that's where Dante's name came from. He was named after the legendary Italian poet Dante. Both children and all their children, as a matter of fact, were pushed toward art and poetry. They would have these big gatherings at their house of all of these exiled people from Italy, and they would have conversations about art and culture, all kinds of things. So Christina grew up knowing very much about the world. She knew about culture, she knew about plays and about works of art. Her brother Dante, who we'll talk about in another video, was also a renowned artist. When Christina reached her teenage years, her adolescent years, her father fell very ill, and their family was pushed into basically poverty. They were somewhat destitute. Christina, and I don't know exactly what kind of health problems she faced, but she was facing health problems. In short, she felt like their whole world had collapsed. Everything was turned upside down. Everything that she had known was different. And so she, her sister, and her mother, notice not Dante, but she, her sister, and her mother became active and devoted to the Anglo-Catholic movement within the Church of England. And she became what we would probably describe as a true convert. She spent the rest of her life devoted to her religion and devoted to these very strict religious principles that she had set for herself based on the Bible. And so later in life, after those adolescent years, or the adolescent years moving forward, she gave up a lot of the worldly pleasures that she had enjoyed as a child, like theater, opera, and even chess. The textbook specifically mentions chess, so that must have been something she enjoyed as a child. She also was engaged twice, but both times she canceled her marriage because neither suitor was devoted enough to God. Neither of her suitors shared her fervor for religion and her strict principles by which she governed her own life. And so she did not feel like it would be a good union, which probably wise. A lot more people should think through the compatibility of themselves and who they plan to marry, as Christina did. So she lived a life rather than a conventional one in which she got married and enjoyed the things that she had been brought up to enjoy. She lived a life devoted to charity, and we'll talk about some specific charities that she was devoted to later, her family, and writing. Okay, so Goblin Market is the very lengthy poem that you guys read by Christina Rosetti. If you have not read it, make sure you do so that what we're talking about will make even a little bit of sense. And this is a long, and I said rather strange, that may be an understatement, narrative fantasy in verse that focuses on these two sisters, Lizzie and Laura, who seem to coexist. They live together, they work together, they prepared food together. There are a lot of details about all the things that Lizzie and Laura do together. They sleep in the same bed, and we don't know exactly what their age is, but we do know that they are young adults. They are specifically virgins, and that they are waiting for their chance to marry and start the life that is expected of them, the life that they seem to want. And one thing to think about background biography wise is that when Christina Rosetti was writing this poem, this is part of that devoting her life to charity thing that we talked about a moment ago. She was volunteering at a shelter for what they called at the time fallen women. And these were women who'd been maybe abandoned by their husbands, who had had a child not being married, and been abandoned by their families, or even prostitutes, sex workers. And so these women were outcast of society who had to reside in shelters. And Christina Rosetti had a soft spot for these women, and she volunteered and worked at these shelters to care for these women and to help them find, some peace and a place in life. And so she saw the pain these women faced due to men and due to sex, basically. And so that's something to think about as we read and consider the themes and the morals that are in Goblin Market. Goblin Market deals with the religious themes of temptation and sin, and the allegorical death of the soul. The fruit that tempts Laura, we can separate this from like an Adam and Eve type story, because which it is about temptation, so it's also connected. But the fruit that tempts Laura doesn't have to do with knowledge or with power, but we get a picture pretty early on that it's more about associated with sexual desire. And we'll talk about some of the details that lead us to believe that. But if you've read it, you probably agree that those words and descriptions of the fruit were pretty obviously having to do with physical desire. This one focuses very pointedly on religious and societal morality, but Goblin Market, one thing that has made it such a popular poem to study and analyze is that it's ambiguous. She never tells us exactly what she meant Goblin Market to be an allegory for, but I think it's pretty obvious that it is an allegory, and we can interpret it in multiple ways. We're going to talk mostly about the most obvious way that it could be interpreted, but it's not the only one. When it was published, there wasn't a lot of pushback regarding it, even though it was a very sexual poem, and the explanation for that is most people probably regarded it as just a children's fable because it included goblins and it was fantasy. It wasn't something that was real. And so there wasn't pushback because most people probably didn't truly understand it in Victorian times, understand her message. For us to come up with this theory that this is an overtly sexual poem about sexual temptations and about resisting that, we have to consider that the goblins, it doesn't just say goblins. The goblins in the poem are goblin men. Every one of them is considered a man. And I know in this painting they look a lot more like rats than men, but they are called goblin men in the poem. We don't know exactly what they look like. We get more description about their actions and the way they move around than what they actually look like. The description of the fruit also leads us to this theory. Even in the very first stanza, it calls the fruit plump, wild, and freeborn, ripe together, sweet to tongue, and sound to eye. And that immediately suggested sensuality. Lizzie and Laura also being young and being innocent, being virgins, that suggests that this temptation is not really for fruit, but it's for the other kind of desire that was taboo at the time and that should be resisted. Especially in Christina Rosetti's view, after seeing the pain and the strife that it's caused all the women who have fallen prey to this temptation. Okay, so the overall allegory, like we said, seems to deal with the dangers for a female in giving into sinful temptation. It also, I would say, has feminist undertones. The men in the poem, they actively tempt Lizzie and Laura and any young maiden, because we also hear about Jenny later on, to taste the fruit, to come and eat the fruit. And we'll see in the second half of the poem when Lizzie goes to try to buy some fruit to save Laura's life, when she rejects the goblins as far as actually eating the fruit herself, they become very violent and forceful. They try to force the fruit into her mouth to get her to eat the fruit. And so that would probably be an allegory for men becoming violent or forceful when sexually rejected. That would go along with this allegory, which Christina Rosetti, at this point in her life, probably did not have a good view of men, because she witnessed all the pain that had been caused by men who took advantage of these women and then rejected them because they were unclean. This also, and this is another theory altogether, this also could be read as an allegory for addiction and recovery. And I know we've talked this semester about opium addiction in artists and poets, even during the Romantic period. I know we talked about Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his opium addiction after having been prescribed opium for depression. But this could also be read as possibly an allegory for that, and that they were tempted to take this fruit as one might be tempted to take drugs that might alleviate one's pain, either physically or mentally, and then to become addicted to it. And that could result quite literally in a loss of life. So this could mean that Laura was tempted by something of that nature and then was able to gain redemption from it when her sister saved her. So I think the most obvious reading is the sexual one, given the way the fruit's described and the fact that all the goblins are men. But it could also be read as an allegory for something else like addiction. Okay, the contrast between the two sisters, Lizzie and Laura, are completely opposite, even though they seem to share a lot of love. They share everything in life, but Lizzie seems to have a very strong resolve not to eat the fruit, to resist temptation at all costs, but Laura's very receptive to it. She hears the goblins cry, buy fruit, come by, come by, come by, and it doesn't seem to take much for her to realize that she doesn't want to miss out on whatever it is the goblins are selling, so she doesn't. She eventually gives in and she goes and she eats the fruit. Laura, and there's a typo on this slide. I'll fix it as soon as I finish the video. But Lizzie has to ultimately sacrifice her own safety to save Laura from death. And this is not physical death. In the poem it is. Laura is literally dying, but this would represent like the metaphorical death of Laura's soul, based on her giving in to temptation, even just this one temptation. Let's talk for a minute about form and rhyme scheme. Throughout the poem, the rhyme scheme is not regular. There's some rhyme, there's some regular meter, but just as you feel like you have figured out a rhyme scheme, it completely goes off rail. And so I think that that's on purpose. Most scholars think that Christina Rosetti wrote it that way to kind of add to the disorientation that Laura feels after being tempted. It's important to remember that the poem's fantasy, that it's all a big allegory, and Rosetti probably wrote it in a way that we would quote-unquote feel Laura's temptation and her confusion and her sorrow and her trying to, reach and figure out where that goblin cry has gone and then what it has done to her, what it's taken from her, and what eating that fruit has done. So she is confused and sort of dissociated from reality in a lot of the poem, and we kind of feel that in the way that Rosetti wrote the actual verses. Okay, continuing a little bit of a summary of the poem. After giving in and eating the fruit, Laura becomes obsessed. As Lizzie tries to go on about the normal everyday things that they do, Laura can't. She's obsessed, and all she does is listen for the cry of the goblins. And she says, am I no more to eat of this fruit? So she panics and she's in sorrow because she answered the call one time and now it's forbidden to her. It's no longer there. Lizzie, on the other hand, she can still hear it. And Laura, it says, and I don't remember the exact quote, but she grows as cold as stone, or she grows as still as stone. I can't remember the exact metaphor there, when she realizes that Lizzie can still hear the cry, but she can't. And so she has a broken heart as she tries to listen for this. And this could possibly be representative of the men that Rosetti believes take advantage of young girls, take advantage of young virgins, deflower them, as they used to call that, and then desert them because they're no longer clean. They move on to someone else because now that particular girl has been disgraced. She's fallen from grace, and that's what happens with Laura. She falls from grace, and the goblins no longer call for her. So Laura, in this state of depression and passionate yearning, becomes ill. Her hair turns gray. She begins to die, just like a girl named Jenny, who Lizzie had warned her about, who ate the goblin fruit and suffered the same fate. So Lizzie, being Sister of the Year, takes a penny to go buy the fruit from the goblins. She can still see them. She does that to save Laura. She hopes that getting the fruit and giving it to Laura will cure her of this impending death. And she resists eating. The goblins try to get her to eat. They try to actually force the food into her mouth, and she resists. And she has a lot of pride over resisting this. She comes out clean. And my time on this video is about to run out, so I'm going to make another video that will be like 2 minutes long. So make sure you watch part 2.